Dawn came to Wilkes County like a ritual blessing, cicadas thrumming beneath a gauze of heat, dew lifting in tiny ghosts from cotton rows that ran toward the horizon like tally marks God had scored into the dirt. On the gentle rise above those fields stood the Caldwell House, a white-columned proclamation of order and wealth. Its wraparound porch was the theater where respectability performed itself, polished railings, neatly turned spindles, a brass knocker that never showed a thumbprint at church time. People in the county called it a jewel. Though jewels can cut as well as shine, the Caldwell name needed no introduction. Planters, merchants, the circuit-riding men of the law, everyone carried a story about Thomas Caldwell, the way he expanded his holdings with a gambler's focus and a bookkeeper's caution, the way he never remarried after tragedy struck once and decided it had done enough. In 1825, when his twin daughters came into the world, their mother left it. This fact was a hush inside the house. The girls grew up within it, as surely as within plaster and pine, learning which doors were for guests and which were for grief. Elizabeth and Catherine, identical, right down to the small crescent birthmark above the right brow, were the visible future of the Caldwell estate, the proof that fortune had roots and blossoms, not just ledgers. By spring of 1847 they were 22. Among their station, that number sounded less like an age and more like a clock striking noon. In Wilkes County parlors, women said it softly, 22, and then glanced toward the window as if the right suitor might be approaching in a dust plume. But if the season felt behind for the Caldwell twins, the house showed no alarm. Routine stayed precise. Breakfast trays, starch, hymnals, embroidery silk sorted by color. The plantation's rhythm insinuated itself into every life around it. From parlor to field bells for dawn, whistles for meals, the evening call that folded daylight into prayer. Yet the people who visited the great house had a way of looking without looking, of measuring within the boundaries of politeness. That was the first unit of currency in a county like this: polite surveillance. Everyone knew something in proportion to how little they claimed to know, which is why Margaret Sullivan's letter matters. Margaret had served the family long enough to be treated as furniture that had somehow learned to speak. And on April 8, she wrote to her sister in Savannah that the young misses have taken to spending unusual amounts of time in the quarters, something the master seemed strangely unconcerned about. The letter would sleep for more than a century between the onion skin pages of a family Bible, as if the truth preferred a holy place to hide. But even before anyone read it, the house itself had begun to record its quiet alarms, footprints where no one should have walked at dusk. A book of poems gone from the shelf and returned with its spine broken. Lamp oil running low faster than a single household could explain. Thomas Caldwell was not a cruel father by local measure. He was efficient, pious in the approved ways, and sentimental only in private. He believed his daughters loved him because there was no other life to choose belief. In his world was a kind of furniture too. In winter, after the cotton gins fell silent and the roads turned to rutted iron in the freezes, Thomas would sometimes walk the galleries at night, listening to the house settle. Lately he had heard restlessness in it, as if the building had learned to breathe shallow to avoid waking someone. He wrote to his brother in Charleston on January 23 that Elizabeth was struck with a melancholy I cannot salt away with good sense. While Catherine seems fevered by the very same weather, he blamed isolation. Weather is a polite explanation when the real one cannot be named. Down the slope and past a stand of oaks that concealed imperfection from the view, the quarters stood small wood structures in lines that suggested order where there was none. About 70 enslaved people lived and labored here. The count fluctuated, as such numbers do. With births and purchases and losses, no ledger can tell cleanly. Work began before the sun bothered to rise. Hands moved in patterns they had been taught and punished into, and voices learned to speak in two registers, one for overseers, another for themselves. Even a glance could carry a message if you knew how to read it. Rumors travel faster than wagons, and by the autumn of 1846, the rumor in the quarters was that one of the Caldwell men, not a Caldwell by name, but property by law, could read. Reading was not a skill, it was contraband. And yet Catherine found Samuel with a newspaper in the stables one evening, the gashed-edge moon making a ragged lantern of his hands. There are moments when the world splits and you step into the seam. That night was one of them. She did not call for anyone. She asked what the paper said. He told her the news had already cooled on its page, and that most papers did not print the truth anyway. She smiled in the way a protected person smiles, the first time someone tells her what protection costs. No household law required Catherine to return, but people who are taught to live inside rules often become experts at smuggling their wishes underneath them. She came again, and the conversations lengthened, and soon it felt like the house itself was leaning sideways to eavesdrop. At the same time, Elizabeth's walks in the gardens shortened in plan and lengthened in practice. Elijah worked the plantings hedges trained to seem natural, flowers selected to appear accidental. He had careful hands, and Elizabeth noticed that gentleness has a weight all its own. The symmetry would later distress the county twins whose secrets mirrored each other's. Bonds that formed in parallel like rails, headed the same direction. The winter that followed was punishing. Freezes caged the fields in grey glass. Wind slapped the clapboards until the house seemed to shiver. Cold keeps people closer, and closeness reveals things. Thomas thought his daughters were afflicted with moods the season had brought in on its boots. But somewhere between the parlour and the stables, a different climate had begun. One in which knowing one another was a more dangerous heat than any summer could provide. Coded notes pressed into a book of verse. Small reassignment of duties, nothing that would stand up in court. But everything that mattered, the usual place at midnight. One scrap would later read, "The moon will be new offering cover." He says C and S will join, 4 hearts beating as 2. There are sentences that act like doors. In a county that slapped back at even the shadow of scandal, the twins' age was itself a rumor. When will they marry? Who deserves them? What does deserve even mean here? The questions stacked like plates. In drawing rooms, ladies puzzled over trousseaus. In counting rooms, men calculated dowries against acreage. Weather, debts, courtship. In that equation was a ledger with charm columns penciled in. Still, something in the Caldwell house breathed differently. Margaret, folding linen in the back hall, saw them pass more often after dark. Lamps were lit later. The parlours smelled of snuffed wicks at hours when no one should have been awake. The truth is that estates like the Caldwells began lying long before any of this. They lied in their design the way the oaks were meant to screen the quarters like a conscience screens a memory. The way a hill allows you to see your dominion without seeing who makes it possible. They lied in their language, calling labour hands and punishment correction, and in the placid Sunday words that recited charity while counting bodies as wealth. If history were only wars and laws, the lie might stand. But history is also the weight of a glance in a lamplit stable when a woman who has always been obeyed chooses to listen. That spring, the county's polite surveillance seemed to miss what mattered most. Perhaps people saw and pretended not to. Perhaps they were distracted by their own crops, their own arrangements, their own rehearsals of respectability. The twins rode out now and then, hats tied under their chins, eyes narrowed against dust. They looked like daughters pictured on mantel daguerreotypes, tidy hair, teedy smiles. But in rooms without witnesses, they were learning to read maps not printed on paper, the pulse of a house after midnight. The places where keys were kept, and how often keys became a ceremony more than a lock. Their childhood had taught them to move softly. Winter had taught them why. Later, scholars would argue about motives, romance, rebellion, moral awakening, all of the above. The record doesn't confess to neatness. What it does show is that, by April, 2 young women raised as the very image of Southern gentility had begun plotting against the most fundamental promise their father's world made, that everything and everyone would stay exactly where he put them. In a country where maps were being drawn to fix space and power, they were sketching one of their own, a narrow route through danger towards something that could be called a life. And in the middle distance, beyond the oaks, the quarters waited, part witness, part accomplice, part graveyard for secrets that could not be left where they fell. On the hill, the Caldwell house gleamed as if cleanliness were a moral stance. But rooms, remember. Floorboards hold a language of weight and timing. A drawer in a writing desk gathers slivers of paper that carry the ink-faint breath of sentences too fragile for daylight. In April of 1847, those rooms were learning a new grammar, the furtive cadence of a choice taking shape. Before long, the county would pretend to be surprised. For now, the house simply listened. The oaks between the Caldwell mansion and the slave quarters swayed like sentinels, their roots drinking from the same soil that fed both master and servant, though not equally. Beneath those branches, the illusion of order dissolved. The air carried the smells of smoke, sweat, and sap life unadorned by chandeliers or sermons. This was the other half of the Caldwell kingdom, the half never painted or spoken of in polite society. To reach the quarters from the main house, one passed through a corridor of shadow where the great house's music, laughter, piano notes, clinking cutlery faded into a quieter rhythm of human survival. It was here that Catherine and Elizabeth began their crossings, first out of curiosity, then out of something closer to hunger, a hunger not for food but for truth, for a world that existed beyond polished stairways and lace curtains. They had been raised to believe the line between the two worlds was permanent, yet by the winter of 1846, that line had begun to blur. Among the roughly 70 enslaved individuals recorded in the Caldwell ledger, two names would one day rise from the faded ink: Samuel and Elijah. They were brothers in bondage, though not by blood. Both had been purchased in 1842 from a collapsing South Carolina estate, an auction where broken families were itemized like furniture. Samuel was tall, soft-spoken, and carried the weary posture of a man who had already seen too much. Elijah was younger, wiry, and sharp-eyed, his movements quick, his words scarce but deliberate. The overseer described them as useful stock. The ledger noted their price, and nothing else. History, however, would learn differently. What set these men apart was not their strength but their knowledge. Samuel had learned letters in the house of his former master, taught in secret by the man's curious daughter, who believed teaching a slave to read might be an act of kindness. She was wrong. It was an act of revolution. Elijah had followed suit, mastering enough to sign his name and read the Psalms aloud in the privacy of night. Both men carried that forbidden fire inside them, hidden beneath the docility expected of their position. For nearly 4 years, they succeeded in keeping that secret. But secrets, like roots, eventually surface. It happened one night in late autumn of 1846. Catherine had gone to the stables searching for her father's misplaced riding crop. She found instead the faint flicker of a lamp and the rustle of turning paper. There, in the half-light, stood Samuel, eyes tracing the lines of an old Augusta chronicle. She froze. He looked up, the paper trembling in his hands. They stared at each other across the gulf that society had carved between them. Then Catherine did something unexpected. She didn't call for help. She asked him what he was reading. He hesitated, then spoke, voice low but steady. "News, miss, though it carries little truth." The reply startled her. The tone measured, calm, without fear, belonged not to a servant but to a man. And in that instant, something shifted inside Catherine Caldwell. She saw not property, not a number in a ledger, but someone thinking, speaking, defiant, even in restraint. When she returned to the house, her pulse beat louder than the clicking of her boots on the stair. That night, she wrote the first cryptic entry that historians would later find in her diary. "He speaks as if words were weapons, and I feel unarmed." The meetings began cautiously. A chance question about horses one afternoon, an excuse to bring him tea another. Then, when the lamps were low and her father's study door was closed, longer conversations whispered through the stable air. They spoke of scripture, of freedom, of what a human soul might be worth when weighed against obedience. Catherine felt something blooming and feared it was madness. She prayed to feel guilt. Instead, she felt awake. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Ever, the quieter twin, walked the gardens daily under the pretense of inspecting the grounds. It was there she met Elijah. He was assigned to tend the hedges and fountains, but his real art lay in shaping things to appear untouched. He had a gentle humor that could disarm anyone, perhaps even a woman taught never to laugh too loudly in public. Their exchanges began with remarks about weather and flowers, but slowly, the words thickened with meaning. When Elizabeth noticed a rosebush he had pruned into an imperfect heart, she blushed before she understood why. Twins often share an unspoken understanding. Late at night, they began to sense the same tension in each other, the same unnameable warmth. Catherine's eyes betrayed her. Elizabeth's silences did the same. It wasn't long before the sisters confessed, not to sin, but to recognition. Then we are both lost. Catherine whispered one night, or both found. Elizabeth replied, to the outside world. The Caldwell twins were models of composure, refined, obedient, untouched by scandal. They dined, they hosted, they smiled when spoken to, but beneath that lace and courtesy pulsed a dangerous secret. By December, they had begun exchanging notes hidden within books and sewing baskets. A line from Elizabeth's poetry volume, later found in the archives, read, "He reads by candlelight, I, by firelight, both burn." In the quarters, Samuel and Elijah knew the risk. To be found even near the main house after dark could mean death by whipping, hanging, or worse. Yet they returned, drawn not by folly but by something that felt more powerful than survival. The meetings became lessons, Catherine learning scripture from Samuel's memory, Elijah teaching Elizabeth small fragments of geography, maps of a world beyond Georgia's borders. It was education disguised as intimacy, or perhaps intimacy disguised as education. Either way, it was treason against the order of things. The twin sisters began to share coded language in their diaries. C referred to Catherine, E to Elizabeth, S to Samuel, L to Elijah. The letters became symphonies of secrecy. S reads the world to me as if it were a book written for both our eyes. E says the garden blooms for L and dies for her. The words blurred devotion with rebellion. Historians who later studied those diaries called them the most dangerous love letters of the antebellum South, not because of their sentiment, but because of what they implied: equality. Winter deepened. The roads iced over. Cotton bales froze in storage, their fibers crackling like old bones. Isolation wrapped around the plantation. For Thomas Caldwell, the season meant financial worry. For his daughters, it was cover, the fewer visitors, the fewer eyes to watch. Nights stretched long enough to hold conspiracies. By January, Margaret Sullivan, the loyal housekeeper, had begun to suspect. She saw the girls returning from the Oaks at hours when the moon sat wrong in the sky. Once, she found a scrap of paper with writing that made no sense. When the moon is new, the heart will be full. She burned it in the kitchen fire, whispering a prayer neither for sin nor salvation, but for safety. Still, she said nothing. Some silences are chosen out of love, others out of fear. Hers was both. Through February, Catherine and Elizabeth plotted small rehearsals of freedom: how to walk unseen, how to hide supplies, how to forge signatures. Samuel and Elijah studied maps stolen from the overseer's desk, tracing the path northward to Augusta, then onward toward Savannah, where rumors spoke of abolitionist ships. The sisters could not imagine the full scope of the danger. They only knew that remaining was another kind of death. Each night brought fresh risk. Each whisper echoed against a history built to crush it. The walls of the Caldwell mansion, so proud and polished, began to close in like witnesses to a crime still uncommitted. Somewhere beneath those same walls, Margaret's letter to her sister slept quietly, preserving the evidence that everything was about to change. By March, the house stood balanced between appearances and truth, between obedience and desire. The twins' reflections in the mirror might have fooled the world, but not the housekeeper, not the men they met in the shadows, and not the history waiting beyond the Oaks. For in those nights of candlelight and whispers, 4 hearts had already begun to beat as 2, and the cost of that rhythm would soon demand its due. The Caldwell plantation was no longer just a monument of Southern wealth. It had become a fuse waiting for fire, and the spark would come sooner than anyone imagined. The winter of 1846 into 1847 settled over Georgia like a punishment. Frost sheathed the cotton bolls that hadn't been gathered, and the wind that whipped through the quarters bit like a lash. By February, the roads leading to Wilkes County had turned to glassy veins of mud and ice, isolating the Caldwell estate from the rest of the world. It was a season that made secrets easier to keep and harder to survive. Inside the great house, the fire burned constantly, casting orange light on portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch with disapproval from their gilt frames. Catherine and Elizabeth spent long hours sewing or reading by the hearth, but their hands trembled more than the cold could explain. Beneath the rhythm of needles and thread lay the weight of two concealed hearts beating in defiance of everything that upbringing and law demanded. The letters began in earnest that February, small scraps of paper, torn from a discarded journal, hidden between the pages of books or under loose floorboards near the servants' quarters. Some were addressed only with initials C, S, E, L. Their handwriting was careful, deliberate, as though each letter might detonate if written too quickly. One such note, later found pressed between the pages of Elizabeth's poetry volume, read, "The usual place at midnight, the moon will be new. Offering cover, he says C and S will join, 4 hearts beating as 2. For historians, that line would become infamous, an almost poetic announcement of rebellion. But in the winter of 1847, it was simply a promise. 4 people, 2 pairs, planning to step beyond the boundaries of a world that called love a crime. The housekeeper, Margaret, whose April letter would one day preserve the first whisper of this scandal, noticed the girls' pallor, the faint bruises under their eyes. They were not sleeping. The young misses look as if haunted. She confided later, not by ghosts, but by choices, when she passed them in the hall. They spoke softly, the way people speak in churches when praying for something forbidden. Catherine's diary from this period grew increasingly cryptic. One entry from February 10 read, "His words open a door I had not known existed. I step through, and the air feels strange. The world is smaller than I was taught, but my heart is larger." Another entry, dated 2 weeks later, was written in a trembling hand. "We have spoken of leaving. He believes it can be done. I believe it must." The snow, rare in that part of Georgia, fell once that winter. It covered the fields in a clean white layer that made everything look innocent. From the upstairs window, Elizabeth watched the flakes drift across the same land where Samuel and Elijah toiled daily. For the first time in her life, she saw not property but prisons without bars. The snow melted the next morning, revealing the same rutted paths, the same suffering, and she decided she could no longer live within that frame. The sister's father, Thomas Caldwell, sensed something amiss. In his letter to his brother in Charleston, dated January 23, he wrote, "Elizabeth suffers a strange melancholy. Catherine, meanwhile, is near feverish, with energy. I fear the isolation of this winter has affected their temperaments in opposite ways." But Thomas misread the symptoms. What he took for cabin fever was in truth the growing heat of defiance. He was a man who believed emotion could be disciplined. Like crops trimmed into order, he never imagined that rebellion could bloom in silence, nurtured by the very stillness he imposed. In the stables, Catherine and Samuel continued their meetings. They spoke of freedom not as a vague idea, but as a geography. Samuel had memorized maps from old newspapers, tracing rivers that might guide them north. He spoke of Philadelphia, a city where men and women of color walked free, where families were not bought and sold. He had never seen it, but the name itself glowed in his voice. Catherine listened as though hearing the word salvation for the first time. Elijah, working the gardens, had begun teaching Elizabeth to recognize northern stars, the ones that could guide travelers by night, the ones that don't vanish. He said, pointing skyward, "You follow that line and you don't stop until the world changes under your feet." She repeated the words back to him like a prayer. Their world outside shrank to maintain appearances. Dinner, prayer, sleep. Inside that routine, they were building another life in secret, one word, one glance at a time. The forbidden had ceased to feel monstrous. The accepted had begun to feel unbearable. By early March, even the plantation's walls seemed to tremble with tension. The overseer, James Whitaker, later testified that the young mistresses had taken to wandering after dark, claiming headaches or air. He followed them once, saw only the white edge of a gown vanish into the oak shadows, and convinced himself it was imagination. Men like Whitaker knew which truths to ignore. Ignorance was job security. The coded notes became more elaborate. Catherine and Samuel used the margins of old Bibles to practice ciphered verses that appeared as scripture but hid directions. One passage from the book of Exodus, written in Catherine's hand, replaced Egypt with home. It read, "And the Lord said, Go out of home and follow the cloud by day and the fire by night." Hidden rebellion disguised as devotion. When the four met together, rare and dangerous, they spoke scarcely at all. Words wasted time and risked discovery. But each carried an understanding deeper than language. They were no longer content to merely love in secret. They meant to escape. The plan was simple and desperate. On a moonless night, they would light a small fire in one of the storage buildings near the quarters. The commotion would draw attention. In that chaos, they would slip away on foot through the woods, heading north to the river. Samuel knew of a ferryman sympathetic to escapees. From there, they would make their way to Savannah, blending among the docks and boarding a ship northward. The twins had access to money, enough jewelry to barter, and most importantly, the courage to believe the impossible. But every rebellion tests its believers. That March, Thomas Caldwell announced over supper that he had arranged marriages for both daughters. Elizabeth will wed Mr. Andrew Pettigrew of Richmond County, it declared, and Catherine is promised to Mr. William Langford of Augusta. The men were sons of planters, their unions designed to expand the Caldwell influence. He said it with pride, as if announcing a business merger. Catherine's fork paused mid-air. Elizabeth's hands tightened on her napkin. Neither spoke. Their father saw only obedience. But in Catherine's diary that night, she wrote, "He has sold our futures with the ease of a man trading land." I smiled as he spoke. I think I smiled because my heart had turned to stone. After that dinner, the sisters moved quickly. They wrote new letters, burned old ones. They gathered coins, silver spoons, anything portable and valuable. Elizabeth sewed small pockets into her skirts. Catherine prepared the distraction. They would leave before their father could finalize the contracts that would turn them into wives and property both. The diary entries grow sharper. As March 15 approaches, their handwriting more hurried, as if written between heartbeats. Tomorrow we tell them nothing. The fire will do the talking. He says the moon will hide us. I pray it hides our souls as well. Outside, the air began to change. The first signs of spring carried the scent of soil softening, of life daring to return. But in the Caldwell household, spring meant something else entirely, a reckoning. The warmth no longer brought comfort. It whispered escape. In Wilkes County, the talk of arranged marriages had already reached the neighboring estates. The twins' union with two prominent families would secure the Caldwells' future, but the gossip that spread behind fans and wineglasses missed the truth. Those futures were about to vanish into the night. While the county slept, the twins rehearsed the path from the house to the oak line, marking every branch and shadow. Samuel and Elijah hid provisions, water, dried fruit, a small knife beneath a hollow log. The last time they met, Samuel pressed a carved wooden bird into Catherine's hand. "For luck," he said. She closed her fingers around it like a vow. The following week, March 18, Itim Baba's Sishati, would mark the end of the Caldwells' illusion of order. The night they chose would burn briefly in the dark, leaving behind a question that no one in Wilkes County could answer. How could the daughters of one of Georgia's proudest families vanish without a trace? The answer, as it turned out, had already been written between pages. between glances, between hearts that dared to beat where they were told not to. The spark had been lit, and soon the fire would begin. It began, as all storms do, with silence. The night of March 18, Itenbabai Sujati, was thick and airless, the kind of darkness that presses against the lungs. In the main house, Thomas Caldwell slept fitfully, his ledger and correspondence still open on his desk, his final thoughts circling debts, dowries, and reputation. Down the hill, the quarters stirred with whispers, rumors of a fire, of movement among the trees, and in the narrow space between those worlds, 4 figures prepared to disappear. Earlier that evening, Catherine had lingered longer than usual at her father's bedside. He had been coughing a rasp of pride and age. "You are all I have," he told her. Half asleep, she kissed his forehead and whispered something that sounded like forgiveness. It wasn't. It was farewell. Elizabeth waited near the window, her travel cloak folded beneath her arm, her pulse drumming in her ears. Outside, the night had no moon, only the dull shimmer of lightning far off over the hills. Samuel and Elijah waited beyond the oak line, listening for the signal. At midnight, the first light flared. A small storage shed near the quarters, a structure filled with old cotton bales and tools, glowed from within like a lantern. Then the fire burst through the roof, sending up a plume of orange and black. The alarm bell clanged, sharp as metal on bone. Dogs barked. The overseer, James Whitaker, awoke shouting orders. Slaves were roused from sleep, buckets of water passing hand to hand. Panic replaced silence. In that chaos, the Caldwell sisters slipped from their rooms. Margaret Sullivan, the housekeeper, later swore she saw them descend the staircase barefoot, skirts gathered, face pas but détermined. They moved like people walking through a dream. She said years later, she wanted to call after them, but something in their eyes stopped her. It was not fear, it was freedom. They crossed the lawn, keeping low. The smell of smoke cloaked them. Near the oak grove, 2 shadows detached themselves from the tree line. Samuel and Elijah. Catherine's breath caught when she saw them alive. Waiting. Real. She reached for Samuel's hand, and in that single touch, years of walls and rules collapsed. Elizabeth clutched Elijah's arm, whispering, "We go." Behind them, the fire roared higher, illuminating the sky like a warning to the heavens themselves. By the time Whitaker realized the fire had been contained too easily, the fugitives were already gone. The search began before dawn. When the household gathered for count, the absence hit like thunder. The Caldwell twins gone, Samuel and Elijah gone. The implication was unthinkable. For Thomas Caldwell, the shame of it struck faster than grief. By sunrise, riders galloped down every road. Notices were nailed to tavern doors and church posts. A reward was offered, $500 for the safe return of the young ladies, and $200 each for the apprehension of the fugitives Samuel and Elijah, property of the Caldwell estate. The language was brutal in its symmetry. The women were taken, the men property. Now, both were fugitives. Whitaker recorded in his deposition years later. The master appeared near unrecognizable that day, his color drained, his speech erratic. He ordered searches through every swamp and hollow, as though the earth itself had stolen his daughters. The first assumption that the men had abducted the twins spread like wildfire. To the neighboring planters, it was easier to believe in violence than in love. The Georgia Courier ran the headline, "Appalling Crime in Wilkes County, Young Ladies Carried Off by Slaves." The article described the twins as innocents ensnared by deceit. None dared print the possibility that they had gone willingly. For the enslaved on nearby plantations, the story traveled differently, passed in whispers that grew with every retelling. They ran, one woman said in secret, all 4 of them, together. The idea of a white woman running with a black man was too strange, too dangerous, and therefore too powerful to forget. For nearly a week, the search parties scoured the county. They found footprints near the riverbank, a ribbon snagged on a branch, but no bodies, no trail, The nights were cold, the marshes endless. Whitaker wrote that on the fourth night, Thomas Caldwell collapsed in the saddle. He seemed less a man than a hollow shell. The overseer noted, back at the plantation, Margaret Sullivan could no longer keep her silence. She remembered the conversation she'd had with Elizabeth hours before the fire. The young woman had come to the kitchen under pretense of tea and said quietly, "If father asks, tell him we are safe." Margaret, trembling, asked where they were going. Elizabeth only smiled, "Where hearts aren't weighed by skin." Then she pressed a silver hairpin into the woman's palm, a keepsake. A goodbye. It was Margaret's letter, written weeks later to her sister in Savannah, that preserved these words. The letter would lie forgotten inside a family Bible until 1952, when it was found during a courthouse renovation, proof that someone had known the truth all along. As the search dragged into April, the tone shifted from urgency to despair. The local militia, brought in under pressure from neighboring estates, combed the woods for signs of the abductors, yet every search returned empty-handed. No blood, nor garments, nor remains. The wilderness of the Georgia backcountry had swallowed them whole. Then came the letter. On May 2nd, a courier from Augusta arrived at the Caldwell estate, bearing a sealed envelope addressed to Thomas Caldwell in a woman's hand. No one knows exactly what it contained. The note was never entered into public record, but witnesses claimed that upon reading it, Thomas staggered to his feet, cursed the heavens, and tore the paper to shreds before collapsing. His physician later wrote that he suffered a paroxysm of rage, followed by apoplexy. In modern terms, it was a stroke. He died 3 days later without regaining speech. The neighbors spoke of tragedy, of heartbreak, of divine punishment. The official notice in the Augusta Gazette read, "Mr. Thomas Caldwell, esteemed gentleman of Wilkes County, passed away suddenly, leaving behind a legacy of honor and deep familial devotion." But Margaret, who closed his eyes that final morning, told another story. "He died," she said, with their names still on his lips, not in anger, more like confusion, as if he had woken in a world that no longer made sense. After the funeral, Thomas's younger brother, Edward Caldwell, arrived from Charleston to assume control of the estate. A man of calculation and caution, Edward cared less about ghosts and more about reputation. As he inventoried his brother's belongings, he discovered a small locked box in Thomas's study drawer. Inside were 2 sheets of parchment hand-drawn marriage certificates bearing the signatures Elizabeth Caldwell and Elijah, witnessed by Catherine Caldwell. Catherine Caldwell and Samuel, witnessed by Elizabeth Caldwell. And beneath them, a letter written in Catherine's hand. In that letter, later quoted in fragments by Edward's private papers, Catherine confessed that the twins had indeed left willingly. Guided not by deceit but by conviction, we have chosen love over comfort. She wrote, freedom over safety. If Father cannot forgive, then let heaven judge us instead. Edward read it twice. Then he sealed it away again, burying both letter and certificates at the bottom of the box. When servants asked what he had found, he replied only, "Nothing worth remembering." Within weeks, the official story hardened. The newspapers printed that the Caldwell daughters had been taken and murdered by escaped slaves. The reward posters were quietly removed. The family's social circle closed ranks, repeating the same narrative until even rumor began to believe it. But the land remembers differently. Travelers passing through Wilkes County that summer spoke of strange sights near the river, a faint glow at night. The sound of women's voices carried on the wind. The superstitious called it haunting, the practical called it nonsense. Yet every generation since has told the story the same way, that on certain spring nights, when the cotton blooms white as ghost cloth, 4 shadows can be seen moving together beneath the oaks, hand in hand, heading north. Whether that vision was born of guilt or memory hardly matters. For the Caldwells, the truth had already burned once in fire and then been buried under silence. But silence, like smoke, never truly dissipates. It lingers, and the next time it would rise, it would do so more than a century later, when the walls of the old plantation finally gave up their secrets, when the coffin of Thomas Caldwell was lowered into the red Georgia clay. The world that had defined Wilkes County for half a century was quietly folding in on itself. The townspeople mourned him as a gentleman and patriarch. Preachers praised his steadfast virtue. None mentioned the scandal that had emptied his house or the daughters whose absence hung heavier than any church bell. The great plantation, once a symbol of order and prosperity, now echoed with disquiet. Servants moved cautiously, as if the walls themselves might listen. Curtains remained drawn even during daylight. The fields, half-tended and heavy with weeds, seemed to mirror the state of the Caldwell name, overgrown with secrets. Into that decay stepped Edward Caldwell, Thomas's younger brother from Charleston. He arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, wearing black wool despite the southern heat. His manner clipped, his gaze sharp. Edward was a businessman first and a relative second. His purpose was not comfort, it was containment. He walked through the house methodically, inspecting ledgers, inventories, deeds. He ordered rooms sealed, servants dismissed, and whispers silenced. The story, as far as he was concerned, would be rewritten before rumor could make it permanent. The official version would say that the Caldwell daughters had been abducted and murdered by escaped slaves. No other narrative was acceptable. Yet as he sifted through Thomas's papers, the house itself resisted erasure. On the third evening, Edward found a small wooden box tucked behind the false back of a drawer in the study desk. The latch was rusted. Inside lay 2 documents folded with extraordinary care. The parchment was crude, but the handwriting unmistakable, elegant, educated, and unmistakably female. Across the top of one page, written in a looping hand, were the words, Certificate of Marriage, March 17, Item Babe Society. Below, the names Elizabeth Caldwell and Elijah Catherine Caldwell and Samuel. Each carried signatures written shakily, but real, and beneath them, in Catherine's handwriting, a letter. Edward read it once, then again, slower. To whomever finds this, we have chosen to leave behind the name that has bound us to silence. We go not as captives but as believers in the simple truth that no soul is born to own another. If Father reads this, know that we sought neither to shame nor destroy, only to live honestly. Forgiveness is not asked, only understanding. Catherine, the ink had bled slightly, as if written in haste or tears. Edward sat for a long time with the papers spread before him, the candle burning low. Then, without a word, he folded the pages, placed them back in the box, and locked it once more. When the housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, entered with tea, she found him pale and trembling. She asked if he had found something important. Nothing, he said flatly. Nothing at all. That night, Margaret swore she heard him pacing the halls until dawn. Edward's next act was deliberate. He summoned the county magistrate, the parish priest, and the editor of the Augusta Courier. Together they drafted a public declaration. Mrs. Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell were abducted by 2 runaway slaves, Samuel and Elijah, presumed to have fled south toward Florida. Given the length of their disappearance, it is feared they met with grave misfortune. The family requests prayers for the repose of their souls. The statement was printed, copied, and spread across neighboring counties. In a single morning, the truth was rewritten. The papers carried sketches of the twins softly idealized, angelic victims. Their beauty was now a commodity for sympathy, their names a shield for the family's respectability. Edward's version of events was airtight. There would be no talk of marriage, no mention of love. The Caldwells would be remembered as wronged, not disgraced. Yet rumors are the ghosts of truth, and they travel where ink cannot. Among the enslaved, the story refused to die. Some said the sisters had been seen crossing the Savannah River disguised as washerwomen. Others claimed they boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia. There were whispers that they had been helped by abolitionist sympathizers, that their escape had been planned for months. In Charleston, Edward's associates warned him that gossip was spreading north. Keep your house quiet. One wrote, better a scandal buried than a legacy unearthed. So Edward did just that. He buried it, By summer of 1847, the Caldwell estate had fallen into a haunted routine. The plantation's fields went untended. The once bustling halls stood silent, except for the echo of Edward's measured footsteps. Visitors came less and less. Uncomfortable in the presence of absence, the new master burned several trunks of correspondence. Seating irrelevance, family portraits of the twins were removed from the parlor walls, stored in the attic under canvas sheets. Even the slaves whispered less, fearing that memory itself might invite punishment. But memory, like water, finds cracks. One of the field hands, a man named Jonas, later told a visiting clergyman that Edward often spent evenings sitting in his brother's study, staring at that same locked box. He'd sit there long after dark, drinking brandy, talking to ghosts. Jonas said, sometimes I'd hear him ask the empty air, why couldn't you just be what you were born to be? The question wasn't for his nieces, it was for himself. Edward was a man raised to preserve order, not confront it. What those two young women had done was more than defiance. It was heresy against an entire way of life. And yet, despite his efforts, the lie began to fray. A decade later, in 1858, a traveler passing through Wilkes County stopped at a roadside inn and claimed he'd met a woman in Philadelphia years earlier who looked uncannily like the Caldwell twins. The story reached the county by mail and was quickly dismissed. Still, the seed was planted. After the Civil War, when news of emancipation reached even the back roads of Georgia, the Caldwell estate had dwindled to half its former size. The cotton fields lay fallow, and Edward, aging and alone, lived there like a ghost among ruins. It was then, nearly 18 years after the night of the fire, that a woman arrived at the gates, asking for him by name. She called herself Margaret Johnson. The servants who saw her described her as refined but weathered, with eyes that carried the echo of the Caldwell twins' gaze. Edward received her in the study, the same room where he'd found the box. The conversation that followed lasted hours. The servants heard raised voices, then silence, then the sound of a single sob muffled behind the door. When she left, Edward ordered his carriage readied. Within 6 months, he had sold the estate and returned to Charleston. Those who spoke to him in his final years said he never mentioned the twins again, except once. When asked about family, he replied only, "Some stories are best left to God." It wasn't until 1958, more than a century later, that Edward's granddaughter donated a collection of his letters to the Georgia Historical Society. Among them was a detailed account of that meeting. In it, Edward admitted what he had denied all his life. Margaret Johnson was Catherine Caldwell. She had come back, he wrote, not to seek forgiveness, but to reclaim the truth. She told him that she and her sister had escaped with Samuel and Elijah to Philadelphia, that they had taken new names, started new lives, and raised families of their own. She had come only to retrieve a small box of her mother's belongings left behind. Edward refused. "The past," he wrote, "is a grave best left sealed." That decision, the deliberate burial of truth, would ensure that the Caldwell story lived on not as history, but as myth, a local tragedy, stripped of its defiance, reshaped into a tale the South could stomach. But history is patient. It waits for attics to be opened and boxes to be found. And somewhere, deep within those papers Edward had tried to hide, the twins' voices still whispered, inked in careful cursive, fragile but undefeated, waiting for someone, someday, to listen. The spring of 1865 arrived heavy with change. The Civil War was over. Slavery was abolished, and the Confederacy lay in ruins. Georgia's fields, once white with cotton, were now scorched brown. For the first time in a generation, silence had replaced the rhythm of forced labor. The world the Caldwells had built on other people's backs had collapsed. And on a humid April afternoon, as the last Union regiments withdrew from Wilkes County, a lone woman approached the gates of the ruined Caldwell plantation. Her dress was plain, her gloves worn, her bonnet shading a face that the servants who remained would never forget. She introduced herself as Margaret Johnson, but even before she spoke, the resemblance was unmistakable. One of the older servants, the gardener Jonas, dropped his rake when he saw her. "Miss Catherine," he whispered. She hesitated, then smiled with tired eyes. "Not anymore." Word traveled quickly. The plantation's remaining hands, those who had once labored under the Caldwell name, watched from a distance as she entered the main house. Her steps slow but sure. Edward Caldwell, now grey and gaunt, greeted her in the study, the same room where, 18 years earlier, he had found and buried her letter. The meeting that followed would become one of the most whispered episodes in the county's history. According to letters Edward later wrote to his wife in Charleston, the conversation began with silence. Catherine, now calling herself Margaret Johnson, stood before him, holding a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside was a locket and a letter addressed to father, written long ago and never sent. "I came for this," she said, "and for the truth." Edward stared at her, his hands trembling slightly. "You're alive," he said, half in disbelief, half in accusation. "Alive," she replied, "and free." She told him everything. How on that night in 1847, they had followed the river north under cover of the fire. How they'd hidden in barns, crossed streams, and joined a network of abolitionists who risked their lives to move fugitives through the Carolinas. How Samuel and Elijah had been guided by a preacher in Savannah who forged them new papers. They reached Philadelphia after 6 harrowing weeks, traveling by wagon, on foot, and occasionally hidden under crates of grain. In that city of brick and bells, they had found a community of free blacks and abolitionists who gave them new names and new beginnings. Samuel took the surname Johnson. Elijah became Davis. The sisters adopted their husbands' names and lived quietly, blending into neighborhoods where skin color and lineage blurred enough to allow survival. Elizabeth and Elijah moved on to Boston, where he found work as a carpenter and she as a teacher in a small abolitionist school. Catherine and Samuel remained in Philadelphia, running a modest livery stable, their first real business. They had children. They built lives that no longer required permission. She told Edward that for nearly 2 decades, she had lived in peace, though always with the ache of unfinished truth. "The world has changed," she said. "It's time the story did too." Edward listened in silence. To him, the notion that 2 white women had willingly chosen such a life, married to former slaves, raising mixed-race children, was more than scandal. It was an assault on the order that still lingered in his blood. When she asked for the wooden box, her father had kept the box containing their marriage certificates and her original letter. Edward refused. "You destroyed this family," he said quietly. "You won't destroy its name." Catherine looked at him for a long time. The name destroyed itself the day it believed ownership could replace love. Witnesses later recalled hearing raised voices, then silence. When the door opened again, Catherine's face was pale but composed. Edward's eyes were red. She thanked him for his time, walked out to the waiting carriage, and left without looking back. The next morning, Edward began selling off what remained of the estate. Within 6 months, the land had changed hands, and the house was abandoned to weeds and memory. Nearly a century would pass before historians learned what Catherine had revealed that day. In 1958, Edward's granddaughter, an amateur genealogist, donated a bundle of family papers to the Georgia Historical Society. Among them was a letter written in Edward's own hand, dated the morning after Catherine's visit. It described the meeting in painful detail. She came back, changed beyond recognition, yet the same in spirit. She spoke of her husband, Samuel Johnson, with the conviction of one who has known love without shame. She said they had children, 3 of them, and that Elizabeth lives in Boston with 2 of her own. I told her the truth must remain buried, for our family cannot endure such disgrace. She said the disgrace was not hers to bear but mine. I saw my brother's ghost in her eyes when she spoke those words. Edward closed the letter with a single chilling line. "If there is mercy in heaven, it will not show me this story again." He never did. He left Georgia soon after, moved to Charleston, and lived out his final years in seclusion. When he died in 1871, the wooden box was never found among his possessions. Some believed he destroyed it. Others whispered that he buried it beneath the oak trees where the sisters had last been seen. Catherine never returned to Georgia. The following year, records show a Margaret Johnson purchasing a train ticket from Savannah to Philadelphia. She rejoined Samuel and their children, living quietly in the city's northern district. Her later letters, donated by descendants to historians in the 1,960 seconds, speak not of guilt, but of reflection. In one, dated July 4, 1866, she wrote, "This nation celebrates freedom today. Perhaps at last, ours too is made complete. Yet I cannot help but think of Father. I hope the light that now touches this land has reached whatever darkness holds him." Her sister Elizabeth wrote from Boston that same year, "For 18 years we have lived in shadows. Now we may walk in daylight. Still, I find myself glancing over my shoulder when a carriage stops too long outside our gate." Freedom, they learned, did not erase fear, it only changed its shape. The Caldwell twins' escape had long been dismissed as rumor, but after Etusinne or Nihundre or Orteokalftres, historians began piecing together the fragments. The diary found in 1964, the letters in Edwards' archive, the city census from Philadelphia all confirmed that the women had not been abducted, as the South preferred to believe, but had fled willingly into the unknown. Their story began to appear in academic journals under titles like Defiance and Disappearance, the Caldwell Sisters of Georgia. Scholars described them as anomalies, Southern women who rejected their privilege and crossed one of the most rigid lines of the 19th century. But the deeper truth was quieter and more human. Two young women who, in the isolation of winter, saw the world clearly for the first time and chose love over fear. By the end of that century, the Caldwell's land was sold off. Divided into smaller farms, the mansion fell into ruin. Its pillars cracked, its roof devoured by ivy. Only the foundation stones remained silent witnesses to a night when 4 people stepped beyond the reach of history. The name Caldwell would survive in legal deeds and cemetery markers, but its story, the real one, had been carried north, tucked into letters, whispered to children who grew up believing their grandmothers were simply from Georgia. It would take another generation before the descendants learned that Georgia meant something far more dangerous and far more extraordinary. When the bulldozers came to the old Caldwell property in 1964, no one in Wilkes County expected to find anything more than bricks and memories. The plantation house had long been abandoned, its roof caved in, floorboards warped from decades of rain. Its white columns stained the color of rust and sorrow. The land had been sold, subdivided, and parceled into new developments. To the locals, it was just another relic of a past too uncomfortable to talk about. But on a humid June morning, a demolition worker swung his sledgehammer against the bedroom wall of the eastern wing, the room that, according to faint architectural records, had once belonged to Catherine Caldwell. When the plaster cracked and fell away, the head of his hammer struck something hollow. He pried it open with the claw end, revealing a narrow cavity between the studs. Inside lay a small leather-bound book, wrapped in the brittle remains of linen. The worker handed it to the site supervisor, who, rather than toss it aside, carried it to the county museum. Days later, archivists confirmed what the cover's faintly embossed initials, C, already suggested. It was Catherine Caldwell's diary, dated from January 1846 to March 1847. The discovery sent ripples through Georgia's historical circles. Until then, the Caldwell legend had been dismissed as a Gothic myth. Twin daughters, forbidden love, disappearance, madness. But the diary turned legend into evidence. The first entries were ordinary weather, social visits, descriptions of dresses, complaints about sewing needles. But by the middle of 1846, the tone shifted. Catherine's handwriting, previously neat, became hurried, as if chasing her own thoughts. Samuel was punished today for answering too quickly. I heard the whip crack from the veranda. It sounded like thunder that refused to stop. I begin to see that silence is a weapon. We are taught to wield it like grace, but it kills more slowly than any lash. Then came the entry from November 12, 1846, one that would be quoted in countless academic papers. I have been blind, not only to the suffering around me, but to the very nature of what it means to be human. S has opened my eyes, and now I cannot close them again, though the light sometimes pains me. Scholars later compared this passage to abolitionist writings from the same decade. Its tone was not sentimental but philosophical, a woman questioning the moral architecture of her entire society. The final entry, dated March 16, was barely legible, written in trembling ink. Tomorrow we leave everything we have known for an uncertain future. We may find freedom or death, but either is preferable to living a lie. It was the last sentence she ever wrote under her real name. The diary became the Rosetta Stone of the Caldwell mystery. Historians at the University of Georgia, led by Professor William Hartwell, spent years cross-referencing its contents with county records, shipping manifests, and letters preserved in other collections. Slowly, a new picture emerged. A single entry in the Savannah Port Register, dated March 28, recorded 4 passengers boarding a northbound coastal ship under the surnames Johnson and Davis. Their listed ages and initials E, C, 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 S, J, and E, D matched the twins and their partners precisely. Further confirmation came from the 1850 Philadelphia census, which listed a Samuel Johnson, occupation livery keeper, living with wife Catherine, age 26, and 2 small children. The same census in Boston showed an Elijah Davis, carpenter, with wife Elizabeth and 1 child. Both families were identified as mulatto, a term historians later realized was a bureaucratic assumption made by census takers confronted with ambiguity. Professor Hartwell published his findings in 1965 under the title The Caldwell Sisters, A Hidden Chapter of Southern Defiance. The paper caused outrage in local circles. Old families called it fabrication. Newspapers refused to print summaries. Pure northern revisionism. One editorial scoffed. But within academic communities, it was a revelation. For the first time, the Caldwell story was framed not as tragedy, but as resistance to women of privilege who consciously dismantled the walls of their own imprisonment. The research deepened through the late 1960s. Newly digitized archives in Savannah revealed shipping manifests confirming the departure of a merchant vessel named the Magnolia, bound for Philadelphia on March 29, 1847. One day after the disappearance, a letter from the ship's captain, preserved in his estate papers, mentioned 2 pale sisters who kept to their cabin, traveling with colored attendants. The captain never learned their true identities. At the same time, the Georgia Historical Society released more of Edward Caldwell's papers. Among them was a second, previously overlooked note, written after Catherine's 1865 visit. In it, Edward confessed, "I fear history will not forgive me, nor should it. I buried truth to spare a name already rotten beneath its polish." It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt the Caldwell family would ever produce. By the end of the decade, the story had captured national attention. A PBS documentary crew filmed interviews with local residents, historians, and descendants. The camera lingered on the diary's brittle pages, the ink fading into brown shadows. When the narrator read Catherine's words aloud, "Tomorrow we leave everything we have known," the room fell silent. But the discovery also raised deeper questions. How many other stories like theirs had been erased? How many women's rebellions, written in fragile cursive, had been buried in the walls of forgotten houses? Historians noted that while enslaved people left few written records, the people who held power often destroyed theirs. That the Caldwell sisters' story survived at all was a kind of accident, a hammer swing that cracked open not just plaster, but silence itself. Local reaction remained divided. Some older residents insisted it was all a northern exaggeration meant to tarnish Georgia's image. Others, especially younger Southerners, saw it differently as a painful but necessary reckoning. In 1972, after nearly a decade of debate, the state installed a small historical marker at the crossroads nearest where the Caldwell mansion once stood. It read, Caldwell Plantation Site 1,841,865. Here stood the home of Thomas Caldwell and family. The Caldwell daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine, disappeared in 1847 under mysterious circumstances. Recent historical research suggests they sought freedom and new lives in the North. We did not choose to be born into this world of masters and slaves, Catherine wrote, but we can choose whether to accept it. The marker was simple, unadorned. Many thought it too plain for the weight it carried. But perhaps plainness was the point. The truth didn't need marble, it only needed daylight. The Caldwell diary now rests in a temperature-controlled vault in Savannah. Its pages scanned, translated, and studied by generations of scholars. Yet the power of those faded words still lies not in what they reveal, but in what they force us to confront, that even in the heart of a world built on domination and fear, two women dared to believe in something different. That history, for all its grandeur and cruelty, can still be broken open by a single act of conscience, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is write the truth and hide it where the future might one day find it. But Catherine's diary was not the only voice waiting to speak. 3 years later, another document would surface, one written not by a Caldwell, but by a man who had once been owned by them, a man named Samuel Johnson. In the spring of 1966, nearly 2 decades after Catherine's diary had rewritten the story of the Caldwell twins, another discovery would emerge, one that gave voice to the other half of that forbidden history. It began not in Georgia, but in Philadelphia, during the auction of a private estate belonging to the descendants of a prominent Quaker abolitionist family. Among the items for sale was an antique writing desk, ornate but weathered, its false bottom drawer stuck fast with age. When a restorer pried it open, he found a small leather journal, water-stained and bound with a length of twine. Inside the front cover, written in careful script, were the words, "Property of Samuel Johnson, Etienne Babesajaba." The name meant little to the auctioneers, but when a historian from the University of Pennsylvania examined the handwriting, something clicked. A quick search through archives connected the name Samuel Johnson with Samuel, enslaved man of the Caldwell plantation. Within months, the journal was authenticated, and suddenly, the silenced voice of the Caldwell story began to speak for itself. The pages were fragile, but the words inside burned with clarity. The earliest entries dated from late 1847, mere months after the escape. They chronicled not romance, but survival. We travel by night, following the river's bend, walking in silence, save for the sound of our own hearts. Every rustle feels like pursuit. Elijah carries a small map drawn from memory. Catherine prays over it as though paper could promise salvation. Elizabeth walks until her feet bleed. Yet when we rest, she laughs quietly, but free. It is a sound I have never heard before, not even in dreams. Each sentence seemed carved more than written. The journal traced their route from Wilkes County to Savannah, guided by a network of sympathetic preachers, freedmen, and Quakers, the invisible veins of the Underground Railroad stretching across the South. One entry, dated April 2, Etienne Babesajaba, described a moment of near discovery. We were hidden beneath sacks of grain in a wagon bound north. The patrol stopped us at the river bridge. Elizabeth spoke from above, saying she was traveling to visit kin. Her voice did not shake. When the patrol moved on, we lay in the dark for hours, afraid to breathe. She saved us all. The language was spare, unsentimental, yet alive with tension. Historians would later call it one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of an interracial escape in antebellum America. But the journal was more than a chronicle of flight, it was a meditation on freedom. Freedom is a strange thing. Samuel wrote in 1848. It does not arrive all at once. It creeps upon you, uncertain, like dawn through fog. I am still learning how to stand upright in it. He described their first months in Philadelphia, how Catherine, now known as Margaret Johnson, took work as a seamstress. While he used his knowledge of horses to earn wages at a local stable, they rented a small room above a cobbler's shop. We are ghosts in daylight. He wrote, "No one knows our past, and yet it follows us like a shadow that does not fade." By 1850, they had managed to open a small livery business of their own, a rare accomplishment for any black man in that era, let alone a man who had once been considered property. Samuel's pride in their progress was tempered by anxiety. The law, he noted, changes slower than men's hearts. He was right. That same year, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed slave catchers to seize alleged runaways even in free states. For families like the Johnsons and Davises, the law transformed freedom into another kind of peril. "See, tells me she dreams of home," Samuel wrote in 1851. "Not the house, but the sky. She misses how the stars hung low enough to touch. I tell her we must not look back, but I do the same when she sleeps." The journal revealed that communication between the sisters never ceased. Letters carefully routed through trusted contacts passed between Philadelphia and Boston every few months. The women remained intertwined even across distance, godmothers to each other's children. Samuel noted the birth of their first son in 1849, naming him Thomas. After the father, Catherine could never forgive, but could not stop remembering. Perhaps in another life, she told him, the name might mean something better. There were also traces of their involvement in the abolitionist movement. The Johnsons attended meetings at an African Methodist Episcopal church that doubled as a safe house. There, Samuel wrote articles and letters for anti-slavery pamphlets, signing only his initials. Catherine, meanwhile, sewed quilts with coded patterns that guided other fugitives along the same path they had once taken. Each stitch, she told him, is a map someone will one day follow. By the early 1852, Samuel's tone grew introspective. He began to wrestle with guilt for those left behind. "Freedom tastes of ash some days," he confessed in one entry. "I think of my mother, of brothers whose names I will never know. I walk the streets of Philadelphia, and every face reminds me that I bought my liberty with silence." But then came the passages that revealed something deeper, the emotional cost of Catherine's sacrifice. She was not made for shadows. "Some days I see her watching the women in fine dresses pass our window. I wonder if she regrets what she traded. Yet when she turns to me, her eyes are steady, and I know she would choose it again." The final pages of the journal, dated 1859, read like a man learning to forgive the world. He wrote of their growing children, of the laughter that filled their modest home, and of Catherine's quiet strength. "She fears nothing now." He wrote, "Not men, not memory, not even God. I think love has made her braver than faith." The 1966 discovery of Samuel's journal transformed the Caldwell narrative yet again. For the first time, historians had both halves of the story, Catherine's words and Samuel's. Together, they formed a dialogue across time, race, and class, a conversation that the 19th century had refused to hear. The Philadelphia Historical Review published selections from the journal in 1967 under the title Voices of the Fugitive South. The article stunned readers. For the first time, Samuel was not merely a figure in a white woman's tragedy, but a thinker, a husband, and a witness to his own freedom. Within months, additional evidence surfaced. Church records from an AME congregation in Philadelphia confirmed baptisms for the Johnson and Davis children between 1849 and 1855. Each entry listed the godparents Elizabeth Davis for the Johnsons, Catherine Johnson for the Davises. The sisters, separated by distance, were still raising their families together, if not in body, then in spirit. Those same records revealed something else. Both families moved frequently, nearly every 2 years, likely in response to the dangers created by the Fugitive Slave Act. Historians traced at least 5 addresses for the Johnsons and 3 for the Davises before the Civil War ended. Their lives were nomadic, cautious, and yet undeniably defiant. By 1855, Samuel's livery business had grown modestly successful. He employed 3 men, 2 of them escaped slaves. Elijah, in Boston, had established himself as a skilled carpenter. Elizabeth taught reading and arithmetic to neighborhood children, continuing the act of literacy that had once condemned Samuel to danger. It was as though each of them had taken the broken tools of their past and used them to build a life from scratch. Still, Samuel never stopped looking over his shoulder. His final entry, dated March 2, Item Babai Wushajo, carried both fatigue and peace. We live in a house we have bought with our own hands. The children play in the yard. At night, I listen to the sound of Catherine's sewing and think this is what freedom sounds like. Not trumpets, not angels, just the quiet work of surviving. When the last page of the journal was displayed at the Philadelphia Museum of History in 1968, a plaque beneath it bore his own words. We stepped into darkness not to hide, but to find the morning. That sentence, simple, unadorned, became the line most often quoted in documentaries and classrooms. It captured what the Caldwell's story had always been about, not escape, but awakening. For more than a century, history had spoken through the mouths of those who owned others. Now, finally, one of the owned had answered back, and in that answer, the echo of 4 hearts beating as 2 could at last be heard clearly across time, across silence, across the distance between bondage and freedom. The discovery of Samuel Johnson's journal opened a floodgate of revelations, but the story did not end there. Over the next few years, archivists and historians traced the threads that linked the 4 fugitives beyond their flight into the slow, uneasy years of freedom, war, and remembrance. What they found filled in the shadows left by the journals and letters, giving the Caldwell saga its last, most human dimension: how they lived, how they fought to belong, and how their story slowly dissolved into the folds of American history. By 1860, Samuel and Catherine Johnson's livery stable in northern Philadelphia had grown into a modest but thriving business. The census that year listed their assets at $400, a small fortune for a couple who had arrived in the city with nothing but the clothes on their backs and forged names in their pockets. Their eldest son, Thomas, helped feed and water the horses. Their daughter, Ruth, attended a free Negro school supported by local Quakers. Letters found among the Johnson family papers, written between 1859 and 1861, reveal Catherine's restlessness even in this newfound stability. In one, she confessed to her sister Elizabeth, "Freedom, it seems, is not a single door but many. We opened one and found another waiting. The world beyond the gate is wide, yet we are still learning how to walk in it." Elizabeth, living in Massachusetts, replied with the pragmatism that had always steadied her. "Perhaps freedom is not meant to feel easy. We are the daughters of a place built on chains. The sound of them will always echo behind us. But the children do not hear it, and that, my dear sister, is enough." When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the past came pounding on their door again. Samuel wrote to Elijah in Boston that first spring, "I do not know what side of this country can claim to be pure, but I know which side I will pray to win." Though too old to enlist, Samuel donated money to the Union cause and helped care for horses requisitioned for the war effort. The Johnson livery stables became a quiet meeting place for abolitionists, soldiers, and former fugitives, a crossroads for those fighting to end the institution that had once defined their every breath. In Boston, Elijah and Elizabeth hosted gatherings for local activists and abolitionist writers. City directories from 1863 list Elijah Davis among contributors to the Liberator, the anti-slavery newspaper founded by William Lloyd Garrison. Within its archives, scholars later identified 4 anonymous letters written by a Southern-born woman, their tone uncannily similar to Elizabeth's. One read, Those who speak of slavery as a stain upon the South are mistaken. It is not a stain but a root. It grows through the soil, through every heart that learns to command without compassion. We escape the root, but its seeds follow us. Another letter, dated 1857, bore a line that would later appear on memorial plaques and classroom walls alike. Slavery poisons the master's soul as surely as it shackles the slave's body. Historians now believe these writings were Elizabeth's disguised, like so much of her life, in anonymité, in Samuel's journal entries from the early 1862s, preserved by his children. His tone hardened into resolve. C. listens to the war reports each night, as if counting the days toward redemption. She says the world must burn before it can be clean. I pray she is wrong, and yet I know she is right. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, Samuel's final surviving entry marked the moment with restrained joy. Today, at last, the law speaks the truth we have carried in our hearts. I held Catherine's hand and told her, now you are free not only by flight but by right. She wept, though not for herself. She wept for the ones who will never read these words. After that, his handwriting faltered. His health declined in the damp Philadelphia winters. In 1873, at the age of 50, he succumbed to pneumonia. His death certificate listed his occupation as business owner, no mention of bondage. No trace of his former name. Catherine continued to run the stable with her eldest son for nearly a decade before selling it and moving north to live with her daughter. Her obituary in an upstate New York newspaper described her simply as a respected widow of good standing. It made no mention of Georgia, no whisper of fire or flight. She died in 1890. Aged about 65, Elizabeth outlived her sister by nearly a decade. Census records show her tending a small farm in western Massachusetts, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. A collection of her family letters surfaced in the 1932, revealing a gentler version of the woman who had once defied the world. She wrote often about gardening, reading scripture, and the grandchildren who filled her home with laughter. Yet sometimes, the old gravity returned. In one letter to her eldest granddaughter on her 18th birthday, she offered a single page of advice now preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society. My dearest girl, courage is not the absence of fear but the will to walk through it. There will come times when the right path will seem impossible. Choose it anyway. The price will be high, but your soul will be light. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, she added, I have known both captivity and liberty. Liberty is the harder work, but it is the only honest labor. She passed away in 1900, leaving behind children who never fully knew the truth of their lineage. Only fragments of the story survived, family whispers about two sisters from the South who followed love into the unknown. By the time the 20th century dawned, the Caldwell name had faded from Georgia's proud histories. The plantation was gone, its acreage consumed by cotton again, and later by suburban sprawl. No monument bore their names, no sermon spoke of their defiance. Their story lived instead in the margins in diary pages, census records, baptismal ledgers, and now, the recovered journals that scholars piece together like bones from an unmarked grave. The first full account of their journey was published in 1969, in William Hartwell's Freedom's Daughters of Georgia, The Caldwell Legacy. It reframed what had once been whispered scandal into a narrative of moral courage. Hartwell's final paragraph captured what generations of silence had hidden. What began as a flight from bondage became something larger, an act of conscience by those born on the wrong side of history who refused to stay there. In the decades that followed, descendants of the Johnson and Davis families began to emerge: professors, teachers, artists, quiet citizens scattered across the North. Some embraced the story, others refused to discuss it. The wounds of secrecy do not heal easily, but among them was one voice that stood out: a great-granddaughter of Elizabeth and Elijah Davis. Interviewed in 1968 for an oral history project at Harvard, her words became the emotional epilogue to the story. When I think about them, I don't think of scandal. I think of courage. They gave up everything the world told them, mattered comfort, safety, even their own names for the chance to live truthfully. I think that's the closest any of us ever get to real freedom. Her interviewer asked if she felt pride in her ancestors. She paused before answering. Pride, yes, but also sorrow, because they had to burn their world to find another. That sentence would appear at the opening of the 1972 historical marker that still stands today. They burned their world to find another. And so, the story of the Caldwell twins became not merely a tale of escape, but a meditation on moral awakening, on how the line between master and slave could sometimes be crossed only by fire. Yet, even as their names returned to public memory, one mystery remained unsolved: what had become of the small wooden box that Edward Caldwell had hidden in 1847, the one that contained the crude marriage certificates and the letter that started it all. Its absence would become the final obsession of the historians who followed, for in that box, they believed, lay the physical proof of love defying law, a relic of rebellion buried somewhere beneath Georgia's soil. And as the 20th century closed, that search would begin anew. The last chapter of the Caldwell story does not begin in a library or a courthouse. It begins, fittingly, in the earth itself. By 1969, following the publication of Freedom's Daughters of Georgia, public interest in the Caldwell twins reached its height. Scholars, journalists, and curious locals flocked to Wilkes County, hoping to uncover some tangible trace of the past, a brick from the mansion, a trinket, a clue. For years, the fields had swallowed everything. The cotton rows that once lined the estate had been plowed over and replanted dozens of times. All that remained were ghosts and rumor. But that summer, a small team of archaeologists from Emory University, assisted by the Georgia Historical Society, began an official excavation at the site believed to be the location of the former slave quarters. It was an ordinary dig, the kind that rarely yields much beyond pottery shards and rusted tools. Yet in late August, one of the graduate students uncovered something delicate, lodged in the soil near a collapsed chimney, a tiny carved wooden bird. The object was simple, roughly whittled from dark walnut, its wings uneven but graceful. On its underside, nearly faded, was a single letter S. When news broke of the find, historians immediately connected it to a diary passage Catherine had written more than a century earlier. He gave me a bird carved from the heartwood of the stable door. For luck, the same bird that had traveled with her on the night of the escape and, it seemed, had somehow found its way back home. The discovery became a symbol. To some, it was proof that love had indeed taken physical form, surviving long after the bodies had turned to dust. To others, it was a haunting, an echo of what had been lost and buried beneath the plantation's foundations. The following years saw more excavations, more fragments, buttons, nails, a child's clay marble, but the most tantalizing clue, the wooden box Edward Caldwell had hidden in 1847, remained elusive. Theories flourished. Some believed Edward had burned it before his death, unable to bear its existence. Others insisted it still lay buried somewhere under what was now a cluster of suburban homes and paved driveways. In 2002, more than 150 years after the fire that began it all, construction workers renovating a 19th-century boarding house in Philadelphia stumbled upon something remarkable. Inside a bricked-up chimney cavity, they found a small cloth pouch, wrapped tight with cord and brittle from age. Inside were two items: a gold locket containing miniature portraits of two young women, identical in face and dress, a folded, yellowed piece of paper inscribed in fading ink, Elizabeth and Catherine, Georgia, 1866. Experts authenticated the locket as genuine to the period. The portraits matched surviving descriptions of the twins' oval faces, serious expression, identical birthmarks above the right brow. It is believed Catherine had hidden the locket before returning south in 1865, perhaps fearing she might not survive the journey. The portraits, painted in the confident style of plantation wealth, depicted them as perfect southern belles, corseted, poised, unaware that 3 years later they would burn their own names to ash. The irony was striking. The world immortalized in those portraits was the very world they had rejected. The 2002 discovery reignited interest in the Caldwell story once again. Documentaries followed, college courses dissected it, and museums mounted exhibits titled The Caldwell Legacy: Love, Defiance, and the Shadow of the South. Visitors gazed at the carved bird, the diaries, the locket fragments of a vanished rebellion. But beyond the fascination with romance and tragedy, a deeper question lingered. Why did this story survive when so many like it did not? The answer, historians argued, lay in the symmetry of its telling. Two halves of a history, one written by a woman born into privilege, the other by a man born into bondage, had somehow endured long enough to meet again. Catherine's diary and Samuel's journal formed a dialogue across centuries, proof that truth can outlive even deliberate erasure. It was a rare miracle of preservation, and yet, as scholars noted, it was also a reminder of how much remains lost. For every Caldwell story, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, that never left the plantation walls, burned away or buried under generations of silence. Today, the former Caldwell estate is unrecognizable. A stretch of paved road cuts through the land where the main house once stood. A row of modest houses now occupies what used to be the quarters. In one front yard stands the 1972 historical marker, weathered by rain and Georgia sun. The text is simple, factual, almost cold. Here stood the Caldwell plantation, 1840, 1865. Daughters Elizabeth and Catherine disappeared in 1847. Later research revealed their flight north with 2 enslaved men. They lived in freedom until the Civil War. Their courage endures as a testament to the power of conscience. No mention of love, no mention of the fire, or the wooden bird, or the carved initials pressed by trembling hands. But perhaps that restraint is fitting. History often hides its emotion behind formality. The land, after all, remembers in its own way, in the way the soil darkens after rain, in how magnolia roots still twist where the foundation once lay. For the descendants who know, the story is no longer legend, but inheritance. Some embrace it, calling it a beacon of moral bravery. Others avoid it, uneasy with its dual legacy, that their bloodline was born from both oppression and defiance. One descendant, a professor interviewed in 2018, summarized that tension with quiet eloquence. They were both the victims and the heirs of a cruel system. Their courage doesn't erase the suffering that system caused, but it shows that conscience can bloom even in poisoned soil. That single idea, conscience blooming in poisoned soil, has since become the inscription on a bronze plaque at the Georgia Historical Society's Caldwell exhibit. Beneath it rests the carved bird, Catherine's diary, and a printed reproduction of Samuel's final journal page. The line he wrote more than a century and a half ago is etched there in his own looping hand. We stepped into darkness not to hide, but to find the morning. The wooden box has never been found. Perhaps Edward burned it, or perhaps it still waits buried beneath the earth, a relic of 2 forbidden marriages. 2 signatures that defied a world, whether lost or hidden. Its absence may be its own kind of truth, for in that absence, the Caldwell story achieves what every great human story must. It refuses closure. It asks questions we still struggle to answer. What would we risk for justice, for love, for the right to be free of the names history gives us? And so, the story ends where it began, 4 figures walking into the Georgia night, carrying nothing but faith, fear, and the belief that freedom, even if fleeting, was worth everything. The fields they left behind have long since turned to dust, but their footsteps faint, deliberate, defiant, still echo across the centuries, a whisper in the dark reminding us, conscience can bloom even in poisoned soil.